I'm really excited today to have the opportunity to talk to you guys about something that really doesn't get talked about a lot and actually gets pretty readily dismissed, and that is being Black in Maine in the 1920s and 1930s. It is a really interesting and challenging topic and just not given enough time or justice, and so let's get this started. Hi, my name is Jen, and this is Outcasts and Dissidents, New England's History of Misbehavior, where we talk about true crime, real renegades, and rebellious countercultures of New England's past. Okay, so if you caught the last episode, you'll remember that we were talking about Lorin Roberts, who comes from a long line of Black ancestry through Washington County, Maine. And he went through a really difficult period in his late teens where a lot of the family died in kind of challenging circumstances, and him and some of his siblings ended up with the grandmother in Millbridge, Maine, instead of the island that they had grown up on. And to be fair, we're going to be talking about this period of Black history kind of in a challenging way, because he's not your average person by any stretch of the imagination. Things were really intense for him, and I'm sure from what I understand of people who knew him or knew of him at the time, he was a really bold personality, and so that kind of helped to hurt him, I guess, and how he was accepted or not accepted by the rest of society. So it's a unique story for sure, but just like the rest of his story we were talking about with his past as a, growing up as a kid and whatever, and even the rest of his family, that his story brings to light what things were like for other people, or things that people were threatened with if they didn't, behave agreeably or whatever. But it also shows what thin ice people were on, and we'll get into it more later, of course, but when he did things, it impacted other people and the rest of the Black community, which obviously shouldn't be the case, but that's what happened. And even then, we did have, constitutional rights that were being violated. So we'll get into that. So yeah, like I said before, it was 1923 when he was charged with his first crime. Now, before we really get into that, I will do a whole episode on this. It's important to note that 1923 was also the same year that the Ku Klux Klan started in Maine. So it's interesting because this second coming of the KKK came from this movie, Birth of a Nation. Now, Birth of a Nation, you don't understand U.S. history if you haven't seen this movie. I've said it before. It's a 3-hour silent film. It is intense, though. I didn't watch it all in one go. I, kept going back to it for a few different reasons, and some of it was just like sheer horror. It was like, this is an overload. I can't take it. So I turned it off and I'd go back to it. But it really goes... so first, it helps you to form like a sympathetic bond to the enslavers in the beginning of the movie, and then it gets into like the history of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and it does so very graphically with actually like really great special effects, considering the fact that we're not even talking about talkies yet. These are silent films, so that was really absolutely incredible. But it almost like, because you have to put yourself into the position of being someone who's never seen a movie or has only seen very few movies, where this is a very novel thing to you, or it was, the 19-teens. And that movie, I think, manipulated a lot of people and made them more susceptible to perpetuating racism and things that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise, say, if this technology with moving picture had been used for good and not evil, but it was used for evil. So here we are. This was Birth of a Nation was based off of a book called The Klansman. I recently found it at an antique store for $75, and I really want it. I have to go back and get it just for my own, obviously academic, not because I agree with any of the premises or anything, but from an academic standpoint, I want it. My mother was horrified. She's like, please don't. So, this, of course, I haven't read the book, but the movie, at least, Birth of a Nation, it portrayed Black men as being like just senselessly ravenous sexual predators, and obviously targeting white women and even girls. And it was shown in Maine. It was shown all over the place. And it's interesting that you end up with these repeated cases of Black men being framed for things like this, like the Scottsboro Boys case. If you don't know what that is, that was down in Alabama, where white girls accused Black guys of raping them. It probably didn't happen, but like the trials were just terrible. And so this is something, and so I want to preface this by saying it's not that I am 100% convinced that Lorin did not commit those crimes. He may have. I don't know. It's not to say that just because Black men are, like in a negrophobic sense, accused of being this way or assumed to be this way or framed even for being this way, that means that none of them were, because that's not true. Because of course they could have been, and he could have been. I don't know. I wasn't there, and I've had a very difficult time tracking down the actual trial transcripts, court cases, anything with evidence, witnesses. There's really nothing. Apparently these records were destroyed, which is absolutely astounding, but that's so far that's what I keep being told by everyone. And I have no idea how true that is, but or why that would even be the case. It shouldn't have happened, but whatever. That's where we are. So the other side of this that I want to talk about before we really get started in his story is that currently the historiography of the Klan in Maine is, or even Black history in Maine, like we talk about slavery and complicity in slavery and all this stuff, but people aren't talking about this era so much, and even the people who are talking about this era are typically dismissive of the impact on the Black community because, like I said in the last episode, our Black community was very small and very limited and silenced. So no, you don't hear these stories. You barely even know these people existed. There were so few of them, and I'm sure they were probably transient too, because this was not a happy, fun place for them. So they would have gone somewhere where they could be around other people, where they felt accepted and probably safer, even if it wasn't necessarily a safe place. But it just felt better than the isolation, I would imagine. So this would have been an extremely isolating and lonely place to be a Black person in the 1920s and 1930s. Even in my lifetime, I've seen it grow significantly with our Black communities, which is awesome. But back then, no. Back then it was shrinking and almost disappeared completely. So what you hear a lot of from people who are talking about the KKK is they're talking about Catholics, and they're talking about Jews, and they're talking about immigrants, but they're not really talking about the Black community. And a lot of times they're like, oh, well, they weren't really affected. Well, no, that's not true. Like, it just wasn't as big of a topic of conversation. But this is the KKK. Like, the bottom line is, this is the KKK, and it was hate speech. It was any others were anybody but a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant was fair game. And so it's not fair for us to say that Black people weren't as affected just because there weren't as many of them. That doesn't mean that these people, the very few that did exist, such as Lorin Roberts in this area, that doesn't mean that they weren't horribly affected and that they didn't face a miserable existence as a result of this social norm, which the KKK in Maine, believe it or not, was a very social norm. Even today, there are a lot of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and there were a lot more Protestants than there are now. Like God beer and whatever. Like that was our culture then. That's our culture. God beer and guns. That's our culture then. That's our culture now, pretty substantially. And it's really sad to me to just dismiss this aspect. This is episode editing, Jen. I want to interject here real quick that an important distinction between the Klan in New England and the Klan in the South is, in other places, is that we didn't have lynchings. So we did have these instances of presumed Klan activity where people were shot at, but we didn't have the lynchings like they did in the South. So that's another reason why people don't talk about this. Back to the episode. And I think it needs to be talked about, so I'm going to talk about it, even if no one else wants to. And even if people don't agree with me that I should talk about it, I'm going to. Because if I don't start, no one will. So yeah, we have a lot of reckoning to do with this whole thing. I'm hoping this is going to be a good first step for that. So, yeah, and I won't get into the Klan too much more, but as things come up that I need to explain, I'll explain them. If you caught the last episode's YouTube video, you will know that I had up on the screen, just briefly, the most extensive court record that I can find, and it's a whole paragraph about where Lorin was convicted in 1923 for the statutory rape of an 11-year-old girl. And was this one of those things where he was framed to preserve the integrity of some white man, or did he actually do it? I have no idea. I just know that he was sentenced to 5.5 years at the Wyndham Reformatory, so I started an episode about this, and I guess I'll just have to publish it. I was like, it's kind of weird out of context, and but it's an interesting place, and it's an interesting trial, so yeah, I could post that sometime. But yeah, so it was basically a prison labor joint. He was sent there for 5.5 years. He escapes a couple of months later, and they found him at the train station in Greene. He had been shot at by pursuers. So one of the KKK's MOs was to have these civilian vigilante groups who were in cahoots with law enforcement or whatever, and they were there to enforce the law as they saw fit, which is kind of questionable sometimes. And of course it was, we all know that. But so yeah, they accused Lorin of a murder in Gray, Maine, which is outside of Portland, while he was escaped. No idea what ever happened with that. I just know that the newspapers reported this had happened. The guy had been robbed. Lorin had been found with things that obviously weren't his when he escaped. And I don't know what happened. Regardless, he was turned over to the reformatory superintendent, Harold Donnell. And they took him, instead of taking him back to the reformatory, they took him to Thomaston State Prison, which is weird because when I was researching the reformatory, I found that usually people would escape there and they would just be taken back there. So I don't know. For whatever reason, they took him to Thomaston, which was an absolute dungeon. And at this point, when in 1923, inmates still were not allowed to speak yet. So say he ended up spending 5.5 years there, that would have been 5.5 years that he couldn't speak. It wasn't until 1924, actually. So the prison burned down in 23, I think, while Lorin was there. And then when it was rebuilt in 24 and they went to reopen it, they said one of the exciting announcements at the reopening party was that inmates would now be allowed to speak in the dining hall quietly amongst themselves once they were seated. Woohoo! Thrilling place. And they were given a Bible. Jesus was their only friend. It was really just not a good place to be. And at some point, Lorin ended up back at the reformatory. I imagine after the fire. I'm not sure. And then he was paroled in 1925, got caught on larceny, got thrown back in, and then escapes again. I don't understand this. But it's like, so the escape was like, the way that the newspaper reported it, it sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, because it's it's, you know, like a Negro, a Swede, an Italian. What is it? So a Negro, a Swede, an Italian, and an Irishman escape from the reformatory and walk into a bar. That's what it sounds like. But yeah, he actually ended up escaped for a while, then he gets thrown back in, and then he gets released. I don't know. But so the next thing I know, he is being hunted by another posse. Washington County authorities were accusing him of breaking and entering, saying that he stole a powerboat, 2 cars, and 7 bags of wool. And so a posse found him in Ellsworth on the Lemoyne Road, which I think is actually Douglas Highway today. And he was in a stolen car, and he had a 16-year-old white girl from Washington County with him. Her name was Marion Steele. Of course, they catch him. He jumps out a window. They fired 14 shots at him, and he took off into the woods. And then they find him again in Franklin, Maine, which, you know, would have been like it would have been a walk. It would have been a for real walk. And then by then it was starting to get dark, and so they lost him in the fog and the dark and the whatever. But the interesting thing to me is that Marion actually was also arrested. So it's framed like he kidnapped her, but then she also gets arrested. And she goes on to pin accusations against Lorin on other people in Washington County. So first Hancock County took her, questioned her, and then released her to Washington County authorities with the information that she was willing to give up on other people. And I have no idea what happened for it, but I also don't see proof that Lorin was charged with any of this, except for maybe her kidnapping and the stolen car that they were in when they were found in Ellsworth by the posse. But I also don't know that anyone else that she implicated was charged. And we also need to remember that back then, 16 was not what 16 is today. So I've seen 16-year-old girls marrying 40-year-old men, and that's fine. To be fair, I've also seen that in my lifetime, where I knew a guy who would drop off his daughter and his girlfriend at high school together. He thought it was hilarious, and it was absolutely horrifying to me. But it's a thing. Okay, so it doesn't actually say where he was caught with Marion, but he also had a friend, or a couple of friends of the family. Some articles say that he was boarding at this house with the Brooks family. But George was also a Teamster in 1920. He was the father, the guy who was running the boarding house, I guess. And then his son Howard, who was actually quite a bit younger than Lorin, ended up being an accomplice of his over the next several decades. But all 3 of them have a rap sheet. Lorin and both George and Howard Brooks. And then there was Eunice, was the daughter, and then there was a mother too. I don't remember her name. But Lorin ended up getting caught and goes to jail for a little bit, gets back out. In the 1930, he was caught on larceny again and ended up in the jail. So if you remember me talking about how I came across this project to begin with, it was the 1930 census. And I only recently just found out why he ended up in jail to begin with, so that was kind of fun. But in this 1930 instance, of course, it was just a theft. But so in 1931, he gets married to Persis Brown, who was a white woman. She was a teacher. Of course, at that time, women had to quit their job if they got married. So even though he was basically unemployable as a criminal, she still was relying on him. But she would just, she was a nanny. She cleaned houses. She would stuff like that. So I actually know people who were babysat by her and whatever. And it's really weird because I thought he was in jail at that time. I don't know, but they got married in Bucksport, Maine. And also Persis was really involved in Methodist and Baptist churches. I think she went from Methodist to Baptist later, and even including like the scary Klan church where one sermon that they had was called the Ku Klux Klan of God. And that was her church. But yeah, she was a very smart woman, but I guess eclectic. She spoke Latin. She was an herbalist. She drove a horse and buggy. Her family owned a brickyard in downtown Ellsworth, and for whatever reason, she decided to marry him. I don't know if it was like his free spirit or what, but even her horses knew where to meet him. So, yeah. Then 1932, I think they actually had a brand new baby at this point. But in the spring of 1932, Lorin was locked up yet again at the old jail. And I think this was the case where he was accused of raping the Brooks family. I mentioned the daughter Eunice. This is where he was accused of raping her. So he ends up being indicted in December, and he was just like, hell no, and he went missing. And so eventually he was found by the authorities. There's, by this time, Sheriff Ward Westcott up at Tunk Pond, which is like the Sullivan area where his step-grandfather lived. And he had gone to the home of this couple, asked for some food, and they reported him. And around that time, in that lake area, there had been a lot of thefts, people breaking into camps and stealing food and that type of thing, which still happens all of the time in these areas. They're just people who live in the woods. And he was one of them at this time. So I don't think they actually charged him with any of those other thefts. I couldn't prove that it was him, but they suspected. And so somebody reported him when he came around asking for food. And that was how he ended up in jail. And that was in February. And then spring rolls around, and he was locked up in a cell. I don't know if they were overpopulated or what, but he was locked up in a cell with someone else. And so I love the way that this is worded in the newspaper article. It says that his cellmate was playing the harmonica lustily as Lorin was sawing through the bars, or 1.5-inch thick steel bars. If you catch the video of this, I'll put up a photo. I have photos of this on Patreon. An example. So I can't get up to that second story window, and I really wish I could right now, but I can't. But I can show you a photo of a different set of bars where someone had started filing through. But I was actually just told by the masonry contractors who are working on the building that they could see where the bars had been welded upstairs, and that's so cool. So, yeah. So him and this guy, Herbert, go out of the window and down to the, they drop down 2.5 stories and run off. And they steal a car a few streets over, and they end up ditching that car. I mean, a good ways away in Cherryfield, Maine, which it takes, almost an hour to get there, I would imagine, back then. And so they ditch the car, and then that's on Blackswoods Road near Catherine Hill, Catherine Hill is one of many roads in Maine that's like notoriously supposedly haunted. And so he ditches the car out there. They steal food and tobacco from a store. And the sheriff puts a bounty out for him, and it was a $50 bounty price on his head. And I mean, they really didn't care if people shot on sight. It was like almost encouraged. So now Lorin's on the run. He's been accused of horrible things. He's now a fugitive from jail, having made a rather daring but successful escape. And he's now in Washington County back home. Herbert ends up getting picked up in Bangor not too much later than that. And yeah, he was like home eating breakfast at his parents' house or something, and the cops found him, and he got thrown back in jail. But Lorin's still on the run. And yeah, so I promised that I would keep these around 20 or 30 minutes apiece. I am up to about 23 minutes now. So I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up, and then I will come along with part 3 soon, where we will get more into this absolutely crazy story, because 1932 was a rough year, you guys. So we will lean into this 1932 thing for a bit longer in another episode, and I'm sure I could get at least another episode out of 1932 alone. And yeah, so I will see you guys next time, or talk to you guys next time. Make sure that you do sign up on Patreon so that you can check out some of these primary sources that I'll share, and some exclusive content, early release, and all of that good stuff. And yeah, like, comment, review. Until next time, I will be wishing you fair winds following seas, and we did equity last time. Let's do some more equity.